Design Notes is a show from Google Design about creative work and what it teaches us. I'm your host, Liam Spradlin. Each episode, I talk with people from unique creative fields to discover what inspires and unites us in our practice.
Let's say you're young, in your 20s, and you get very good at a certain kinds of, programs. And you get so good at that, and you can give your clients exactly what they want and deliver every time perfectly. And then all of a sudden you're 60. And what have you discovered? Nothing. Because, to get somewhere new, you have to do things you don't do, and you have to surprise yourself.
In this episode, I spoke with Laurie Rosenwald, a graphic designer and illustrator in New York who has built a philosophy around making mistakes. In the interview, Laurie and I talk about what inspiration actually means, how to cultivate a career around the unexpected, and how her philosophy can apply to any discipline. Let's get started. Laurie, welcome to Design Notes.
Hello.
I want to start off the interview the same way that I always do, which is by asking what brought you to your current work and how that kind of creative journey has influenced what you're making now.
Well, my current work is my always work, and it was really fun because, oh my goodness, what is your name again that I met this morning? Phil. Sorry. Anyway, Phil asked me, how long have you been in New York? And I said, since 1955, which is always a fun answer to that question. So I've always, I've basically been painting and drawing since when most people start, when you're 2 or 3 years old. The thing is, I never stopped. And I don't really draw much of a distinction between the commercial and the non-commercial, or fine art and commercial art, even though maybe I should. For me, because I've always done painting, graphic design, illustration, since I can remember. And for me, it's a kind of a big mush. And sometimes it's a commission. Sometimes I get paid for it. Sometimes I don't. And every day I'm doing visual art of one kind or another. But I went to RISD, and when I got out, I wasn't really thinking about, oh, this is a career. I just never thought about it. I was always kept doing what I started with, drawing.
You said that you don't make a distinction between commercial art and fine art, and that maybe you should, and I'm really interested in why you say that.
Well, I've been joking a little bit that, commercial art makes a swell hobby, because the fact is the last couple of years I've been concentrating on doing books, which are not necessarily a fabulous way of making lots of money. I've spent a long career doing mostly editorial illustration and graphic design projects. I think what I do is, compared to what most people do, much more all over the map and non-specialized. So like one day I'll be doing a typographic poster, then I'll be doing a portrait of Amy Winehouse, then I'll be doing an animation with David Sedaris, then I will be doing writing or doing a storytelling event. It's always been like that. Even when I was in school, I was in several departments at RISD, and I've continued to do very varied things, but to me, they all help each other and they all affect each other. Like, a lot of my paintings are of letter forms, so there's graphic design and painting meeting. Or I do portraits as an illustrator, and I also do portraits as a painter. Or, hand lettering, or whatever it is sort of feeds the other practice.
How do you decide which medium is right for the thing that you're trying to make?
Well, that kind of depends. It's sometimes I'll use a really unusual thing, like I've spent a lot of time in Sweden. I wanted to have a friend film me while I was doing lettering and then put it on Instagram or something. And I wanted to do things that people could steal and maybe sign their emails with. Like, for instance, I did one with ink that says, "You magnificent bastard," which I think is a great phrase. And I did it in ink, and it's a little bit Ralph Steadman-y. If you know Ralph Steadman, it's like very spiky and angry looking in a fun way. And then I was looking for a squeeze bottle. I was in my friend's apartment because I often draw with a squeeze bottle full of paint, and I make a very blobby line with that. Sometimes I use fabric paint. And the only thing I could find in their fridge was a bottle of sriracha. So I did all this lettering in sriracha, a very angry, but I think funny, like I did a you magnificent bastard in sriracha. And then I just wrote the word sriracha.
That reminds me, I saw you speak at the Type Directors Club recently, and one thing that stood out to me from the beginning of your talk was the example you gave of creating a bird out of paper scraps. And I'm wondering if you could describe that a little bit for the listeners.
Yeah, well, I always show images of that particular story when I talk about my workshop. I've also been teaching a workshop for many years called How to Make Mistakes on Purpose, because I found that it came from my own insecurity and my own feelings of inadequacy, because even though, like I said, I've been drawing all my life, sometimes I would get, especially as an illustrator, a brief that I thought was silly, like draw the 21st century mom. Like, what does that look like? So I would just start with a blob on a paper, and it could be anything. So the blob turned into a detail of her dress or her hair or the background or a cloud or anything. But if I started with a white blank sheet of paper and really trying hard to envision what the art director was asking me to, that didn't help me. What did help me was a formal thing, which is having a blob or a mark of some kind on the paper and building from there, so that I was never alone with a white sheet of paper. So another good thing about that is that, in my opinion, a lot of things look alike because we've all been working with digital media since the 80s, including me, and I'm not against digital anything. I use Photoshop and Illustrator and all that stuff every single day. But I think if you only use digital media, it's a drawback, because I think that, let's say you're making a drawing and I'm making a drawing. If you're doing it in Illustrator, you're both using Illustrator program, they're going to look more alike because Illustrator wants to do certain kinds of perfect things. But if we're drawing with shoe polish on a paper towel, they're going to be more different. And I think you need that kind of clash between the digital. You need to bring something handmade and organic and spontaneous and a surprise into the digital realm for it to be exciting. At least for me, that's something I needed to do. So, for instance, I was doing a children's book and I had to draw a picture of a canary. So, like everybody on Earth, I could go to Google Images and get a billion canaries. Nothing against Google Images. I also use that every day, like everybody does. In this case, I didn't want to do that. So what I did was I took some ripped black construction paper and ripped it into 10 or 12 pieces. And then I took a digital picture of it. And then I turned one of them into a canary by coloring it yellow and sticking a beak and some legs and the word canary in 800-point type. And it's a canary. I like the power of the wrong thing. So none of those ripped papers looked like canaries, but I forced it. And I think that because the virtue of doing things that way is that it's surprising, so it's fun for me, and it's also fun for the viewer because it's not going to look like if I went to Google Images and then looked at a canary picture and then drew it in Illustrator. It's just not. It's going to be different, and I like different.
You mentioned earlier this idea of sitting down to a white page or a blank artboard or something and trying to put what the art director has said onto the page with nothing, no blobs, nothing to go on. And I think a lot of people can probably relate to that feeling of like trying to sit down and turn on creativity.
Exactly.
And I'm wondering how you get around that, especially in settings where you might be on a deadline or when it's just more difficult?
Well, it really has everything to do with the element of surprise and wanting to be surprised myself rather than going from A to B. It's more like finding things rather than starting from nothing and creating something from a void. So, like I said, I would make a blob if I'm doing a drawing, or even if I'm doing, a poster, I could take, for instance, in my computer, I have a zillion things that I've made by hand in black and white, and that's what we do in the workshop too, is basically create chaos. So I have all these different chaotic images. Sometimes they're washes or torn paper or different kinds of lines or blobs or squares or patches or whatever, textures. And when I want to make a poster, especially when I'm under deadline, I'm just saying poster, but it could be anything, I could grab one of those washes. Usually things are in black and white, so I can change the color in Photoshop. And I could make that the sky, or I could make that the hair, or I could make that whatever. so that these things live, like having a fantastic, like on a cooking show, or, you have this pantry, which everything imaginable that goes on forever. And that's what's in my computer, in those files, in those folders, are elements that can become anything. So I'm never alone with a blank screen or a blank piece of paper. I make sure I'm not, because I don't like it.
You mentioned this element of surprise being something that can help you get started on this and start putting together these ingredients. Have you ever been surprised at the end of a creation?
Yeah, with things that I come up with, of course. Sometimes I run into trouble because, especially on a formal level, if it's a style or the thing looks different from a lot of the things that I've done before, a creative director or an art director doesn't like it because they were expecting, oh, it will look like the Uncle Sam that you did for the Atlantic or that page you did for the New Yorker. But I think that if you get a good rapport with an art director, they maybe will see that there is, even though it wasn't what they were expecting, that there's something good in it. And that happens 9 out of 10 times, but not every time. Because a lot of people, they have a picture in their mind's eye, what they're expecting, and nothing else will make them happy.
So you work in this really broad range of media with all these different materials and techniques. And you mentioned like the art director who doesn't get what they might have in their mind or expect. So they have some conceptualization of like what your work is, even though it encompasses like all of these things. How do you conceptualize it?
Well, I think the people that I work best with and really know how to use me as a designer or artist or whatever the hell you want to call it. And I think that there are certain wonderful people that are willing to take a chance on me, that I'll do something exciting, because when I start, I don't really do the whole thing where you make a sketch and then you make that you know exactly before you even begin what it's going to look like. I'm bored with that myself, and I don't want to spend my days doing that. So everything I do is kind of an experiment. Although I have to say, I'm very experienced as a draftsman. Sounds such a weird word. As a drawer. And I've trained these all my life. So I know how to draw, and I know how to create something from nothing. So it's really important to me, like I said, to combine something I draw by hand with something digital and not just be digital. Because, I've done that. It's like, Wallpaper Magazine used to have like a lot of illustrations. I actually never worked for them, but I did some things that looked like what I call the wallpaper style, which is drawn in Illustrator, very clean. And I like the way they look, but you can't tell one illustrator from the other. They all look the same, because they're all using the same technique and the same applications. And that's, I think, especially among younger creative directors, they're discovering, of course, that it's wonderful to have elements that are made by hand, and it brings individuality and warmth to whatever project you're doing. So, yeah, I guess the most successful projects are where it's sort of like a collaboration where you're both sort of discovering something new.
Something else that stood out to me from your talk at the Type Directors Club was at the end during the Q&A when someone was asking you, where do you get inspiration, or like, how do you get inspired? And your answer to that was that you have never been inspired.
It's true.
And that really made me think. So I'm interested in expanding on that, and also knowing, where does your work come from?
Well, like I said, probably a lot of the people at Google and, people doing creative, they just keep drawing, and they grow up and they bring their experience, their life experience into their drawings and their work. And it's more like that when I say I'm never inspired, it's because the word inspiration to me, it's sort of like you're a Praxiteles or something, and some muse alights on your shoulder and whispers in your ear. I've just never had that romantic kind of experience of breath of inspiration, like a poem, or it's more like I wake up, what am I going to do today? And if I have an illustration assignment, I look at that, and then I start experimenting. And if I don't have any assignment, maybe I'll make a painting or work on a book. I think, work is more fun than fun. I think I would be lost if I didn't at least attempt to do something creative and fun every day. And sometimes it's writing, sometimes it's painting, sometimes it's an illustration or a piece of graphic design.
Something that I'm really interested in recently is understanding how the work that we create as creators or artists or designers or whatever we happen to be relates to the world. And one thing that you said, I believe in an essay, was that your work or your aesthetic tends to fly better in Europe. And I'm curious about that, why you say that and why you think it's the case.
Well, I'm from Manhattan. I'm born in Manhattan. I've lived here most of my life. And except for I went to RISD, mostly here. But I've also spent a lot of time in Europe. And I always, since I was a teenager, started turning right. You got to go somewhere. But if you're from Manhattan, where do you go, you know? I think the artists that influenced me the most were always, Matisse and Picasso don't come from, Kansas. And also Japanese art. And I also had a lot of clients, especially when their economy was crazy booming in the 80s and 90s in Japan. I did department stores, all kinds of things, just really fun, big projects in Japan. Packaging and stuff for Shiseido. I had a show there. So I had my 5 minutes of fame in Japan back then. But in Europe, for some reason, I think probably it's like a mirror reflecting the things that I like, which happen to be a lot of art from Europe. I mean, I kind of hang out at the Metropolitan Museum and, I get very, if the word is inspired, but I get ideas from the paintings there and, artists like Stuart Davis or Charles Sheeler or Arthur Dove or Marsden Hartley, or that's the period of art that I like the most, is early 20th century painting. And a lot of them actually were American, come to think of it. But them and Picasso, who's my favorite.
So do you think that it's this kind of, I'm really trying not to use the word inspiration, but this kind of like kind of reflection of the art that you've seen from European artists or have seen in Europe that makes the work more successful there? Do you think that it's a kind of aesthetic sensibility that's different between the two places?
Well, I think that, Andrew Wyeth is a good example, I think, or Grant Wood or somebody like that. In American art, I think in general, people are a bit suspicious still of abstraction or things that are kind of abstract, which I would guess, I would describe my work, or most of it, as kind of abstract or like kind of minimal. But, I'm still telling a story. But the abstract tradition in painting, anyway, is mostly coming from Europe. So if that's what I relate to, then no wonder, I had a lot of success in France and Germany and doing a lot of magazine work, especially. In Italy, I worked with Fiorucci back in the day, which was really fun. So, yeah, it's just, we sort of like the same stuff.
I think when you talk about abstraction and the desire for something to be as close as possible to a photograph, it's interesting because a lot of your work incorporates these handmade elements that are essentially a composition or a photograph of certain pieces, like the paper canary or like cardboard or something like that.
Well, I use photography, digital photography changed everything for me because I would make those, like I was talking about the elements, like I have a scribble or I have a texture in a file. I have a folder called textures, okay? So in there I have like paint roller, I have ripped paper, I have, wishy-washy wash. It's very practical. Like the stuff we do in the workshop is super practical. And a lot of people do the workshop that have nothing to do with art and design, and they're the ones that love it the most. Like they send me letters afterwards saying that they came up with some great business idea. Like, I always show the movie Working Girl with Melanie Griffith, which is an 80s movie, which is fun. But she comes up with a great business idea because she's reading a gossip column just for fun. She's not trying to come up with a business idea. But it's really about the random, bringing in the random, because we're also good at our jobs. And I think that's a bad thing sometimes. That, let's say you're young in your 20s and you get very good at a certain kinds of, programs. And you get so good at that, and you can give your clients exactly what they want and deliver every time perfectly. And then all of a sudden you're 60. And what have you discovered? Nothing. Because, to get somewhere new, you have to do things you don't do, and you have to surprise yourself. I kind of don't like to say what we do in the workshop, but it really is creating chaos. But don't worry, in a safe way. And then afterwards saying the magic words, oh, what could this be? Rather than going from A to B and problem solving, which is nothing wrong with problem solving. But there should be also room for surprise. So therefore, room for, discovery and innovation, something new. Because you've got to break the pattern. You have to sabotage yourself. This is what I do, is I need to sabotage myself. And I discovered that, and I help other people do it to make something new and different happen.
I think what could this be is super interesting. And it speaks to the point that I think I was trying to get to, which is that using actual tangible materials and not just software veers away from abstraction and then sharply towards it, because you understand like what this thing is, but then it's presented to you as something completely different.
Right. Like one of the things that I very often, talk about, and I'm working on a book also about this work, Mistakes on Purpose book, is that I once did this, and I'll always appreciate Kurt Anderson, who has a Studio 360 radio show, and he's a brilliant writer, and he was the MC or something for the AIGA conference, national conference, a number of years ago, where I did the workshop, and he liked it. So he said, why don't you do it on my radio show? And I was thinking, okay, because it's a very, visual thing. But I did end up doing it just for his staff, the people that worked on the show, and they didn't air it, but I didn't care. It was really fun. But right before we did this, the producer called me up and said, so I want to just talk about what's going to happen next week, And then he said, well, what if you're not a designer? What if you're not an artsy person? Or what's the point of this workshop? And I said, well, suppose you're a radio producer. And he says, I'm listening. So, okay. So I said, well, part of your job is to maybe talk to Laurie and find out what's going to happen next week, like you're doing right now. So I said, you could ask me like how I came up with the idea, or where did I go to school, or any number of where was my studio, or anything. That's problem solving, and that's good. And I don't want to get rid of that. I don't want to go into this baby state of ignorance. No. But for one question, you could bring in the random. And I said, okay, I opened a book on my desk. I said, I'll do it now. So the first words happened to be gold bullion of this novel I happened to be reading that was on my desk. So I said, okay, Laurie, do you rake in the big bucks with these workshops, or is this hippie thing you do for only art schools? Or, I made it be about money, about gold. And maybe that's not a good question, but what's valuable is that it's probably one he wouldn't have asked me. So when you bring in the random, like flipping open a book at a certain page, I could ask you a question based on, this piece of tape that I found on this table. That is valuable because it gets you somewhere you haven't been before.
Now I'm thinking about what questions I should ask.
Well, sometimes it's as simple as, like, literally, like what's on the table before you. You have a can of soda, you have your phone. I think either of those could create a question. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe have you ever tried designing something on a phone?
That's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked me. The answer is not really, but I've used my phone in my work because I'm lazy, and I'll see something that I want to photograph, and of course, you always have a camera with you with an iPhone. So I've used it certainly to, I could take a picture of my glasses or whatever, and so I've used the phone in that way, but also now I have an iPad Pro, and I draw on that sometimes. There's this really great magazine called American Bystander that I've been working with, and there I published like a full page. I worked in this particular case with Risa Mickenberg, a friend of mine, but we did this piece called Amazon Prime Suspect, and I did all the illustrations for it on the iPad because I wanted a rather realistic representations of all. It's a shopping list of things that are available on Amazon, and all of them are available verbatim, exactly. So it's a shopping list that tells the story of a murder. So it's this woman, there's like Cozy Shack rice pudding and a onesie and, cat food, and there's this woman living alone and she's lonely. Then some man comes into the picture, and at first they have real sexy times. So there's like, believe it or not, octopus sex chair is You can get it on Amazon. So I drew the octopus sex chair, and then he starts to annoy her. So I have like beard restraint, fart dampeners, and it ends up with a body bag. They have all these things on Amazon. So to draw these things, I did the most opposite of what I usually do, and I would just draw products. I would trace them in the program called Procreate, and it worked great because in that particular story, I needed to be very realistic and not abstract and show that these things were really available on Amazon, and that was a lot of fun. So yes, I draw on an iPad, which is sort of like drawing on a phone, and you can draw on the phone. I've tried in notes or yeah, but it's it's too small. And also drawing freehand, not tracing or anything, but to draw, you can just draw with your finger on the iPad, and it's really kind of great. I want to get better at that, though.
Well, the system works. I didn't know that question would end up at Octopus Sex Chair.
Exactly.
I also want to talk just a little bit about another book you've done, which is called All the Wrong People Have Self-Esteem. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
I did this book, and it was kind of the opposite of all the touchy-feely, self-esteem-y things that are out there that seemed a bit disingenuous to me. Like, how can I put this? Like, the reason I called it All the Wrong People Have Self-Esteem is, first of all, because I think it's funny, and second of all, I think it's true, and thirdly, you could feel bad about so many things. You could think you're fat or you're ugly or you're stupid or, all kinds of horrible things. And it's not like I want people to think. I think that the people that don't have these doubts, they're jerks that nobody likes, It's like all the wrong people think they're all that. They think they've got it all figured out. And there's nothing more unattractive than someone who thinks they're, the bee's roller skates, whatever. So, you don't want to feel bad about not having self-esteem like you should. So it's another thing that you could feel bad about. So that's why I called it that. But it's funny because it's also a very, just like me, I guess, it combines, collage, freehand drawing, computer drawing, and writing, and a lot of different stories. And people weren't sure, is this a humor book? Is this a graphic novel? Is this really a self-help book just because it has self-esteem in the title? So I'm trying right now in my career to unconfuse people. I'm not sure that's a word, but like I'm redoing my website. A friend is helping me do this right now, and I'm going to make it a little bit more traditional because the way it is now, even though it looks fun, and I like the way it looks, it's Rosenworld, right? Rosenworld.com. And they go there, and there's a part about the workshops, and there's a part about the stories, and there's things about the paintings, and then you illustrate. And it's too much. It's just too much.
Yeah. And that leads into my final question, which is, where do you see your work going in the future?
Well, what I'm hoping for is that memoir will be a big hit because I spent many years writing, and this is really a collection of all the things that I've written, and I've put a lot of time and work into it because it's really funny. And, on the one hand, it's with an agent now, and he's a good agent. His name is Paul Bresnik, and he has done some very high-profile books with some really good writers. But, this is not an easy sell because, who's going to read the memoir if somebody's not famous? I wouldn't. So it's got to have something else. I think my strength is the funny in the book, and it's kind of unusual that at least the illustrated version is also very colorful and fun. And so I'm putting a lot of maybe eggs in one basket, but I want to do, because I love books, I want to do more books. I want to do more workshops in interesting places, in big places, in unexpected places. I want to do the book about the workshop. So those are some of the things I want to do. What will happen? Nobody knows. I don't know.
But that's the exciting part, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you again, Laurie.
Thank you for inviting me, Liam. This was fun.
You can subscribe to Design Notes on Google Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave us a review on iTunes or let us know how we're doing with an email to design@google.com. Thanks for listening.